How would you like to reflect your plea?
Your Honor, on behalf of Mrs. Daybell, she enters a not guilty plea to both charges and the request for a pretrial and a jury trial.
And welcome to Law and Crime Now, everybody. I'm Jessie Weber, and the woman you just saw in court is Lori Vallow Daybell. She pled not guilty to conspiracy charges out in Idaho. You might recall that she has been accused of helping to cover up the remains of her dead children who were found in her husband Chad's backyard. Disturbing case, disturbing story, and now we're going to move into what happens next. Joining me right now is New York Law School professor Kirk Burkhalter and Law and Crime legal analyst, criminal defense attorney Julie Rendelman. Happy to have you both here. Professor, I want to start with you on this because it seems pretty straightforward and what we expected, that she was going to be pleading not guilty to these charges. Relatively short hearing. What did you make of it?
Yes, it was a relatively short hearing. I think it was somewhat pro forma. She was obviously going to plead not guilty. I don't think there would have been any type of deal on the table here. The real fireworks, so to speak, will come at the trial. She will certainly have an uphill battle, given that the children were found on the property where she resided. However, this hearing was, as you mentioned, it's just rather straightforward, and certainly neither the defense nor the prosecution would want to tip their hand in any way, shape, or form at this particular point.
Now, you mentioned a trial, but the question is, what kind of trial would we have? Because Julie, Rob Wood, who's the prosecutor in this case, he is trying to get the trials, both of Lori Vallow and her husband Chad, tried together. One trial. So the issues are very similar. Now, John Pryor, who represents Chad Daybell, objected to this. He said, joining the cases combines the coverage of both defendants, local media as well as national media, and only adds to the level of attention and knowledge prospective jurors would have in this case. What do you think about that argument, Julie?
So there's a lot of arguments why they shouldn't be joined. I'm not sure that's one of them. Whether you have one defendant or both defendants being tried at the same time, this has national attention regardless. I think the issues for a defense attorney are whether or not there's any conflicting antagonistic defenses, whether for one defendant or the other, that would make it impossible or prejudice one defendant or the other if they were to be tried together. Particularly, for example, if one gave a statement that inculpated the other, then that would be a hearsay issue that potentially would raise issues about joining them together.
Julie, let me just stick with you for a second on this. Do you see any kind of antagonistic relationship? Because from one hand, they look like a concerted, combined front, that they're united. Apparently, Chad was visiting Lori every day until he was ultimately arrested. Even their phone conversations, they seem to be on the same page. Now, there are others. Nobody has any real love for Lori Vallow, and they believe that she'll turn on Chad in 1 second, say, hey, that was his yard. I had nothing to do with it. I didn't know what was going on. And it's very maybe easy for her to say that, considering the fact, let's not forget, neither she nor Chad have been charged directly with the kid's death. They haven't been charged with murder or anything like that. So is there a sense that there could be an antagonistic scenario?
Sure. And look, I mean, people, married couples that are together, once they're in front of a jury, things change very drastically. And keep in mind, she has a defense attorney. He has a defense attorney. And one would assume that the defense attorney for Lori Vallow is going to want to represent Lori Vallow. And one of the best ways to represent Lori Vallow is to pin it on the other defendant and vice versa. I'm not guaranteeing that that's going to happen, but when you're able to kind of point certain pieces of evidence to another individual, it certainly helps your client. So only time will tell whether or not she eventually sees the light of day.
Well, I'll tell you, it's tough to predict what will happen in that case, but it's kind of tough to predict what will happen in any case, and that moves me on to the next big case that we have to talk about, because there's a lot happening in the George Floyd saga. So the defendants in that case appeared in court for a motions hearing. It actually marked the first time that Derek Chauvin, the former officer charged with murder and manslaughter, made an in-person court appearance, and there were a lot of eyes out in Minnesota watching what was happening, even though there were no cameras allowed in the courtroom. Just give you a sampling right now. Here's what was occurring. There were some protests occurring outside of the courthouse. Here's a sampling of what we saw.
I don't give a damn what time it is, because we're going to be out here. You cannot put this thing in a place or at a time that will not have us out here. I want to talk isn't any probable cause because they got to investigate and they got to look at the autopsy and see if the guy really died and blah, 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 you know, because they were free to roam all that time. So then they pick him up and then they start talking about, oh, well, you know, what should we arrest? Down deal before you even came to court the first time? You ever heard of that? I ain't never heard of that. Make a deal with a guy before he even gets arrested? That's Mike Freeman for you, by the way. We call Mike Freeman. Y'all sign that petition, okay? Mike Freeman needs to go. I don't even know why he's on a cheap-ass deal. Slide him on out of there and give the other three a walk down the park. And that's some bullshit right there. Now, people wouldn't put up with that. And yay for the community for not putting up with it.
Okay, there's a lot to get through. Professor, I want to start with you. One of the biggest developments is that the judge disqualified Hennepin County Attorney Mike Freeman, as well as some assistant attorneys, from working on the case any longer because apparently he said they conducted sloppy work by, and they basically have created themselves as witnesses in this case for interviewing the medical examiner, Dr. Andrew Baker, regarding his autopsy of George Floyd, without having a non-attorney witness present. So break us down what exactly happened here and how much of an impact is this moving forward?
Well, this is rather amazing. So as we know, attorneys and prosecutors conduct interviews and they interview witnesses and so forth prior to any proceeding all the time. For a judge to allege that this was sloppy work and that they would now become possibly witnesses seems to be somewhat unusual. Now, this is a high-profile case, as you just saw from the protests and the demonstrations, and those are going to go on throughout the totality of this proceeding, without a doubt. So there's a lot of pressure on the court and everyone involved to get this right and to ensure that justice is served and wherever it may lead. So I think the judge is looking at any actions that may have been taken ahead of time that may be reversed, cause some type of reversible error, right, where one of the parties could appeal. And this could possibly be the case here. Now, whether or not they would be successful in appealing, I don't know, because this seems to be something I haven't seen much at all in my experience.
Right.
However, I think the judge is just being very cautious.
So just to follow up on that, and again, you know, the medical examiner is so important here because the question of what was the cause of death, you know, there's the prosecution says clearly the officers are to blame. They put force on upon Mr. Floyd. That contributed to his death. That caused his death. While you have the defense saying, no, it was the drugs in his system. Now, one of the interesting things we've seen, Professor, I just want to stick with you on this, is that you have now the former officers blaming each other. So Derek Chauvin says that the responding officers were to blame because they didn't handle the situation properly. They should have called paramedics. They shouldn't have been struggling with Floyd. The Thomas Lane, Alexander J. Kung have said, hey, listen, you know what? We were just following Chauvin's orders about what to do. Then you have Tu Tao who says, I wasn't involved. I didn't touch him. I was on the side doing crowd control. Is this what you expected, all the officers blaming each other?
Oh, absolutely. Well, absolutely. I would certainly expect that because as you rightly pointed out, the cause of death, the manner of death, this is all at issue. These are going to be critical issues in the case. And if you're one of these other former officers, you want to distance yourself from any of these actions that in particular cause death or whatever the case. Also, you have the main actor, Derek Chauvin here, was this seasoned police officer, the training officer, and these other three officers, their first line of defense is going to be, hey, I was a rookie. I think one of them was out of the academy for 3 weeks, and I was, in essence, following orders or pressured. I wasn't seasoned enough to take action. So absolutely, with the sentences and the penalties they are looking at, they would have no reason to stand together in some type of united front. I would fully expect each and every officer to distance themselves, to claim that they did not have the same intent or culpable mental state as Derek Chauvin, nor did they take any action whereby one could say they were acting in concert in any way with Derek Chauvin.
And that's what actually kind of was echoed in court about should their cases be tried together? Do they have conflicting interests? Are there similar fact patterns? Or, you know, as the prosecution said, if you try them separately, this is just going to be an ongoing case. And do you want that in this kind of situation? Julie, I turn to you because one of the other big issues here, how are you going to get a jury And the judge said, look, we might have to do a jury pool months in advance, which is different because usually it's several weeks in advance. But he is planning, I think, once they narrow down the jury pool, 2 weeks for jury selection. But as was echoed in court, there's a big concern of outside influence upon a jury. In fact, people have already been making threats towards the judge and the prosecutors. How can you get impartial jury in this kind of case, Julie?
Jessie, you were at Harvey Weinstein every day, and you saw, if you recall, the protesters, and they were not as many protesters as we've seen daily we've been seeing in the George Floyd case. And there were a lot of discussions about the fact that the judge was not dealing with the fact that every single time a juror walked in the room, this is what they were seeing. And so now you have a situation where a judge has his hands full in trying to figure out how he's going to not just pick a jury, but how he's going to keep that jury away from those individuals. Can you hear me? Sorry.
Tough case, because this is one of a kind. And I tell you this much, look, the decisions on all these motions are going to be coming later in writing, and we expect the trial, in March. There might be a pretrial hearing sometime before then, but we're going to keep a careful eye on what happens next. Look, we're going to take a break. When we come back, big update in Jussie Smollett's case. We'll be back. Turn now to Jussie Smollett, the former Empire actor who's been charged with lying to police about being the victim of a hate crime attack. We haven't heard a lot from him. Well, he decided to change that because he sat down for an interview on Instagram with Mark Lamont Hill. Now, in this interview, he continues to press that he is innocent, that he has no reason to stage an assault upon himself, and that really this whole idea is BS. Now, who does he blame for all this? Watch.
And the sad part is that there's an example being made of someone that did not do what they're being accused of. You got to really look a little bit deeper, and you got to think about the fact that these departments, these prosecutors, these police, they're frat boy fraternal order of police. All of these departments, they get funded, they get promotions, they get these types of incentives, not from solving a case, not from solving a case based on truth, based on fact, but in fact winning the case. So if your first motive and your main motivation is to win a case, well, then you're going to win at any cost, which means that you're willing to throw people under the bus that don't deserve to. You're willing to coax people into lying about things and saying things happened that did not happen. There is a tape of the from what I've seen, and there is something, but of course it cuts off right before it happens. And
why does it cut off, you think? I mean, you could see how someone could say, wait a minute, this tape cutting off at this moment is awfully convenient. What do you say?
I certainly didn't have the power to cut the tape, so who cut it? That's something y'all got to ask yourselves. I'm not here to, I'm in a case, so y'all gotta do the detective work.
Okay, Julie, let me just first preface this by saying, yes, Smollett is presumed innocent, but do you get the sense him blaming prosecutors, him blaming law enforcement, and he is levying serious accusations here? Do you think he might possibly be taking advantage of the anti-police climate that we are in to say that he is the victim here? Because this is quite a statement that he's making, Julie.
Jessie, everything you just said, you took the words out of my mouth. The first thing I was going to say is keep in mind he's innocent until and unless proven guilty. But yes, I think, and this should bother people. And again, I wasn't there when this incident happened, but to me, based on the evidence we've heard so far, there seems to be clear evidence that he did, in fact, make this up. And I guess what bothers me and should bother the community is the idea of someone taking advantage when actual individuals are harmed due to the lack of police reform. I don't think he falls into that. And to me, it bothers me more that he continues to kind of jump on the bandwagon with regards to that at this point.
Professor, he had mentioned there's a tape corroborating his story, that it gets cut off. We don't know who it gets cut off by. At another point in this interview, he says there are other witnesses out there to corroborate that white men attacked him. So far, I can't make a sense of what he's referring to. So these are big statements to make. He intentionally made them during this interview. What do you think about these statements?
But I think there are 2 points here. The first being, I would love to see this tape and these other witnesses and all this other evidence. As Julie pointed out, he is innocent, and you pointed out, until proven guilty. However, let us consider this. For what he is saying to be true, the police, prosecutors, city officials, including the mayor of Chicago, would have had to likely have conspired to frame him, given all the national attention and all the hands that would have to be in the pot to fabricate, hide, or in some way, shape, or form, deform evidence. So that's the first point. So I would just like to see that happen. And to the other point that Julie made, and that you also made, I most certainly hope that Mr. Smilet is not taking lightly what is going on around the country and using it as an opportunity to serve himself. To do so would be a travesty of enormous proportions in this time. So I would love to see this evidence that he's discussing. If it's out there, I don't know why he wouldn't bring it forward, given that this is still an ongoing matter. I'm sure he retained some type of legal counsel. Well, maybe that person will be clarified.
It begs the question, and Julie, I'll give you the final word on this. Did his attorney sanction this? Did they want him to do this? Did this ultimately help him? Because he seemed to say being quiet wasn't helping him too much. I'll give you about 40 seconds on that.
So the simple answer is no. No attorney wants their client to speak. Again, keep in mind that anything he says can be used against him. And once again, I don't think anything he said helped him. He is an actor, however, and he does do a lot of acting. And that is something you must consider when you're listening to him speak, even in this climate, because he is prepared for what he said, and he's been preparing for a while to try to get his story out there.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll see if he does any more interviews. All right. I want to turn to the last story of our program, one that we've been following, and that's Vanessa Guillen. She was the Fort Hood soldier who was found dead. Army Specialist Aaron Robinson is believed to have killed Guillen before ultimately committing suicide. And now it's come out that 3 soldiers, when they were interviewed by investigators, may have unintentionally given Robinson an alibi that led investigators away from him, which may have led him or allowed him to ultimately flee. Now, ABC's 2020 is dedicating an entire special on this case, and here's a sample of it where they really discuss the issue of timing. Take a look.
What we didn't maybe expect was the media broadcast.
Human remains have been found during a search for missing Fort Hood soldier Vanessa Guillen.
And the media broadcast was really kind of what we believe to be the tipping point for Specialist Robinson to flee, because then he learned that those remains were found, and he was on the phone with Sicily at the time.
Professor, I'd like to turn to you. This is a disturbing account, what we're hearing here. Now, no one has alleged, as of now, that these soldiers lied, but they were mistaken about the timing. They apparently saw or said that they saw Guillen smoking at a certain place, and they thought she had left this area where Robinson was at a different time, but they were mistaken about the time. This inadvertently led investigators to not rule out Robinson because they still considered him a suspect, but they said, oh, he has an alibi here. This is huge in a case where people are questioning every move that was made.
Yes, it is. And it's unfortunate because without knowing for sure, it certainly reeks of somewhat sloppy investigative work. For instance, in the news account from 2020, it just showed, oh, we didn't know the news was going to get hold of the story. Well, the news gets hold of the story because the law enforcement agency, whoever's doing the investigation, puts that information out. And also when dealing with suspects and witnesses and so forth, you have to be cognizant of what questions you ask, what information you gather will be shared with others or in some way, shape, or form. In many cases, may provide someone with an alibi. So it kind of points back to the CID. And like I said, without being overly critical, because we don't know all the facts, that's the problem here. And that's what this case basically has been about since the beginning, that the investigation into the disappearance and then, of course, the death really moved quite slowly and wasn't done as thoroughly as one would expect from law enforcement professionals.
Julie, let's talk about protocol here. Robinson wasn't detained. He had an unarmed escort, and apparently he was not in custody at the time. but apparently he fled from that unarmed escort. Chase ensued, and we all know what happened. When he was confronted by police, he ended up killing himself. Is that standard operating procedure here?
I don't think so. And, I go back to what Kirk said. It seems like the blame game is that the reason that this all happened was because of the news catching the fact that the body was found. Keep in mind, it's not just that he fled. He was able to flee, and he was able to actually get access to a weapon and kill himself. And so one wonders why he wasn't being monitored much more carefully to make sure that that couldn't happen. Keep in mind, even if there was potentially the ability to rule out some of the timing, there were still questions. I mean, people get time wrong all the time in terms of even if a soldier is trying to tell the whole truth about the timing. And so the idea that he was completely off their radar makes absolutely no sense.
In a case, really, where people want so many answers, there's the fear that they won't get them. So clearly, Robinson, he can't explain anything. Now, his girlfriend, Cecily Aguilar, she has been charged with ultimately helping him to dispose of the body. She is going to face a trial, and she has already provided answers to many of the questions, but not everything. What was the motive here? How did this go down? And again, we don't, Robinson presume that he did this, but is that what ultimately happened? And this has cast a spotlight on the military in a way I don't think they ever anticipated. So as we continue to follow this case and understand how this all laid out, maybe we'll get a better understanding. Professor, Julie, thank you so much for coming on. Until next time, everybody, be safe out there.